This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 334, Leading a Drupal Team in Government. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about leading a Drupal team in government with Abigail Bowman and Larrimore. Laura is the Chief of Digital and Creative Services at the branch of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, USPTO. And Abby is the Web Chief at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, also known as the ATF, and the Drupal GovCon organizer that's in charge of virtual logistics. Abby and Laura, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi. What's new with you this week?
So much. Apparently my kids have started listening to the show. They listened to it on the ride home with their mom yesterday, and they appreciated my shout out last week about I don't know, playing in the snow and glitchy video games. That was it. So, hey kids, shout out if you happen to listen to this. I will also say, again, related to the kids, we got my son one of the Amazon virtual assistant thingies for his room. And if you say, wake word, play silly songs, it plays a pretty interesting playlist of songs. So there's something for the listeners out there. Last and not least, working on my personal site, which I don't do as often as I probably should or would like to. Jump back into it this past weekend on my Linux laptop. I know, Linux, weird. But using Lando and Pantheon, I ran into like this issue where for whatever reason, database would just not start. Like was not created in Docker, was not, just nothing. And looked through the logs. The logs were kind of like meh on like, hey, your problem is this. Did a Lando rebuild, did a destroy and build, did like all of the Lando things I could think of, went into Docker, made sure there were no like miscellaneous containers running, did all of the things. But the thing that actually fixed it was actually deleting the images in Docker. So I went into Docker and like wiped every single image that I had. So that way they were forced to be re-downloaded and rebuilt. And for some reason that just magically fixed my problem and everything started up the way that it was supposed to. So my working hypothesis there is either the MariaDB image was bad for some reason, or that the Pantheon image may have changed and that for some reason, Lando was not pulling a new image and using that. So I don't know, but you happen to run into that problem. Maybe you, instead of, blowing away all the things, just start with your images.
Also joining us for the fourth week is Abby. What's new with you this week?
Yes, just to what John said, I love how that Amazon assistant has now basically made that word. It's like she who shall not be named. No one can say it. If you have somebody who has a name even similar to that, it's chaos.
The bright side is they put hey in front of Siri. So
right, exactly. You have some way to limit it, but it's a mess. They need to do something. So 2 quick updates. Over the weekend, actually, Laura and I got together and we are working on this project that's basically this tiny like paper/wood house craft. It's cool. Like $30 on Amazon. They have a bunch of different rooms. They have like a little greenhouse, a little bookstore, a little whatever. And I got to say, if you're even like remotely crafty, I highly recommend it. It's cheap. It's really fun to like do in a group because everyone can work on their own little thing. Like I've got like a little table and a little side thing. So very, very satisfying. It's probably going to take me about 8 years to finish, but we just like plug away at it every once in a while and it's really fun. I recommend it. And then my game of the week, I've been obsessed with the new Pokemon game on Nintendo Switch. So John, I don't know if your kids are into that.
Tell me more.
It is incredible. I was telling Laura, it's a revolution in Pokemon games, which makes me sound horrendously nerdy, but it's, if you've played Breath of the Wild on Switch, it's like Pokemon meets Breath of the Wild. It's a whole open world. And instead of like a, 2D or 3D going through the grass
top down.
It's not top down. It's fully 3D. And like, while the Pokemon are battling, you can like run around and like, look at them, or the Pokemon will literally attack you. Like you're just running through the world, like Breath of the Wild. And there are Pokemon like out doing their thing. So, and if you get up to like dangerous ones, they are going to like attack and kill you.
I have a question though. So yes. You're telling me that for the first time in 30 years, Game Freak finally changed something for the better?
Yes. And that's why everyone's head is exploding about this game. There's definitely like stuff that could be better, but it's overall, I think, really polished and super, super fun.
Okay. I got a couple of key questions here.
Yes.
Because yes, my son is all about Pokemon. He has a Shield or Sword, one of those. And then he has the one previous to that, like Let's Go Pikachu, right?
Yes.
Which I actually kind of liked a little bit more than Shield or Sword, but whatever. Does this one have multiplayer, like on Switch multiplayer, as opposed to like LAN party multiplayer?
I don't think so. I think it is. I think it's local. I'm not totally sure. We should check this. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I know you can like run around with another trainer, like in the wild areas. I don't know if you have to be on the same network or if you can be remote.
Yeah, well, I know. I guess it's more on the same device than separate devices, because the Shield requires 2 devices. Like you have to have your own device. And then like same deal. Like you can catch Pokemon, you can battle people. Like all of that stuff is kind of like same.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. It's set in feudal Japan, like ancient Japan. So it's very wild. So there's only one big main town, and then there's just kind of little tiny villages. So you actually battle other people. You still battle other trainers, but it's less often. You're more battling. There are these giant sized Pokemon with glowing red eyes that are kind of these mini bosses roaming around. And so they're So
it probably used the Breath of the Wild engine then, it sounds like.
It might have, right? I don't know how Nintendo did that, but
that sounds like it sounds like the bosses in Breath of the Wild, but it wasn't a dungeon, it's kind of just a big boss event.
Right.
Thing.
Okay, I'm now gonna start.
They need this, John. I'm amazing.
Gonna look into this. Okay, carry on.
Fun fact for our listeners. Last thing: Pokemon is the most valuable franchise on the planet. Beats out Star Wars, Harry Potter, Marvel. All of those. Pokemon by far is the most valuable franchise out there, which I always find interesting.
Yeah.
So also joining us for the first time as a guest is Laura. What is new with you this week?
Yeah, so this week, my husband and I have been really enjoying watching the Olympics. I do love the Winter Olympics. We just kind of bounce between all the different events. Okay. And I've definitely, I both enjoy watching people be awesome, but I also, it's a good reminder, like a lot of the Olympic events, even these really amazing Olympians, like they're falling down, they're trying jumps that they don't make. And so it's got me thinking a lot about kind of how we incentivize some of those innovations, particularly like some of the really crazy, like big air events where, if you make it, it's amazing. But a lot of times people don't make those jumps, and that's just part of the competition, and that's considered okay. And it's not penalized too heavily. So I think that's kind of interesting and good thing to remember.
Okay, so for me this week, just a quick update. I think I may have mentioned this on a couple of shows ago, but I've got a client that's been using Storybook pretty extensively. And for listeners that don't know what that is, it's a style guide generator, built-in Node, and it's we're using it in this particular project to build some native web components, and it is just super powerful, super quick, has a ton of great features. I think the best feature is it has an add-on with 0 configuration. You just add it on and it does accessibility tests on every build. And like super fast, like you make a change, it immediately builds and be like, this is now failing for contrast in 4 different places, for example. So you can very quickly, you can make sure that you're running accessibility tests on every component every time you change something. Super cool. And I'm sure I'll have more stuff to talk about as we go, because every time I dig in deeper, I find another really cool feature.
I hope you guys do an episode on Storybook, because I am fascinated by it. And that's something we're hoping to do with our US web design system implementation. So
interesting because I am also working with Storybook right now. So yeah, there's probably going to be a show about that in the near future.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's funny because we initially were talking about doing Pattern Lab because the Drupal role kind of uses Pattern Lab, and so I'm more familiar with that. And I just ran into a couple of quick issues with native web components and Pattern Lab, and decided to kind of like see what else was out there, and realize that Storybook, was much better fit for native web components and had a bunch of other features. So I started making the case. We have to make the case to make the switch because we have been talking about Pattern Lab. And is it well supported? Is it going to last a long time? So I started looking into it. It's like, well, Pattern Lab has 10,000 downloads a month and Storybook has 10 million downloads a month. So yes, I think it's popular. I think it's well supported. So it ended up being a pretty easy sell. But moving on, we have a quick insert from the organizers of the Florida Drupal Camp, which is coming up next week, I think, on February 18th, I believe. So we have a quick message from them.
Hi, this is Mike Herschel with Florida Drupal Camp, and holy cow, the Florida Drupal Camp site just launched. With me, I have Adam. Hey, Adam.
Hello.
Adam Varn and Amy June Highline, the Aaron Winborn Award winner. How's it going?
Thank you, Mike.
Adam, what are the dates for Florida Drupal Camp?
It is February 18th through the 20th, 2022 in beautiful Orlando, Florida.
Ooh, do you know what the average temperature is in Orlando that time of year?
I believe it's about 75 degrees Fahrenheit.
You are correct. Amy June, can you give us an overview of how many days this conference is?
It is a 3-day conference. Friday is trainings, half and full day. Saturday is a full day of sessions, and Sunday is sessions and contributions.
We have a brand new website, rockin' Drupal 9, brand new theme. It's at fldrupal.camp, and everyone who's listening is invited to this. And hey, Adam, are we going to have an alligator at the camp, like for real?
We are. We're going to have an actual alligator that you can pet and see and get your picture taken with, and he probably will not bite you. Probably.
Yeah, that's a maybe. But we're seriously going to have an alligator at the camp. And so check out the camp. Session submissions are open. Sponsorships are open. We have 2 of our 3 featured speakers announced. And yeah, so fldrupal.camp, February 18th through 20th, 2022 in beautiful Orlando, Florida. And we're in person. Holy cow. I know, right? All right. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you guys for that. Again, looking forward to see what comes out of Florida Drupal Camp. We've been starting to discuss what we're going to be doing in New England, and I know Nerd Summit's been having some discussions as well. So yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting year for conferences. So we also have a new module of the week. This module is kind of inspired by Abby, although it's not quite the module you were talking about. So there is a module called Menu Breadcrumb. And I use this on a site because the client has a use case where there are several pages that are root pages, but they want them to show up in the breadcrumb somewhere else. So they want to have, a URL that's something easy like what to bring, but they want it nested under some other items. And so Menu Breadcrumb allows you to set up breadcrumbs based on where in the menu a page is rather than just by path. So it merges kind of well. So if you have it if it's not in the menu, for example, it will default to path. But if it's, if it doesn't, it kind of falls back to the menu. So you can have almost everything on the site pretty much a flat architecture. So a lot of URLs are very easy to remember. But you can set your structure using the menu. Now, there are a couple things to consider. One is, you still need to have some nesting for something like, a blog, for example, because you're not going to have every single blog page in a menu, or
Yeah.
You shouldn't.
That was going to be my question to you, because we're researching these options now and looking at that. And we're like, what do we do with our news posts? What do we do with blogs?
Yeah. So in that case, you would do something like /news/whatever, and then
URL based.
Yeah, it would fall back on that. Now, there is one caveat that I found that kind of occasionally rears its head, and that is that for some reason, it occasionally doesn't handle language very well. Like it will occasionally cache one language. It's breadcrumbs, but not the other. So on English, if English is the first page that gets visited, it'll show the correct breadcrumbs on English. But on the Spanish side, it'll show it as only being a root page, and vice versa. Usually cache clearing fixes it. And it happens maybe once every 6 weeks or so. But if you are a multilingual site, it's definitely something to consider.
Watch out for.
Yeah, there's just some cache context that is getting dropped. And I've spent a fair amount of time. And a shout out to Greg Boggs, who's the maintainer of the Easy Breadcrumb module. He kind of helped out. I think I might have mentioned this a few months ago, but he helped out with, trying to figure out what was going on there. But I've certainly reduced the amount of times that it happens, but every couple of months now, the client will be like, hey, breadcrumb issue's back again, clear cache, and it's fine for another 2 months.
Nice. I like that it can layer with other approaches too, because that's, I think for certain, I kind of charted through our different content types. I'm like, for these URL based makes sense, but for these we want menu. But what if we create a basic page and it's not in a menu? Oh God, what happens? So
yeah, one of the other things to consider is if you have more than one menu. I forget how it interacts, because I think you basically set an hierarchy of menus. So if you have a about page that happens to be in a user menu as well, for whatever reason, as well as the main menu, you can say like, just use the main menu as the default, and it would put it there, even if a person got there through the utility menu or the user menu. So that is something to consider as well. But yeah, it's a useful module. I think the only thing that has really made me consider not, switching away from it is that multilingual issue. And like I said, with a lot of the fixes that we've applied, it happens infrequently enough that we've kind of just stuck with it. But if it didn't work, I think Easy Breadcrumb would be the next place I would look.
And are these patches in existing issues for your multilingual fixes, or stuff you guys have figured out on your own?
They're patches that are posted, so I'll post links to that.
Yeah, I might check that out. I had one last question for you about this module, because I'm literally in the middle of researching this for us. So what happens in our Drupal 7 site right now? We have a couple like critical links that actually appear in 2 different places on the menu, right? So a STEM careers page lives in our careers section under that part of the menu, but also has a shout out in the menu in the laboratories section, for example, just so that if users come from 2 different main ways, they're still able to find it in that side menu that's limited to that section. So how would it handle that?
Same menu?
In D7, it's different menus. In D9, we were hoping to have one main nav menu and then just handle with what level of menu you're showing in the sidebar. But
I could try to test that, but I don't know how that would resolve. I honestly think it would just be the first appearance in the menu would be the one that it would get.
Gotcha.
And that the first, and when I say first one, it probably, I don't know if it goes by hierarchy or by like menu ID. I would suspect it probably goes by menu ID. Like it finds the first match. To be fair, another reason why it's a little bit complicated on this particular site is we also have, I did find that I had to do some pre-processing because for whatever reason on the Spanish side, it adds an additional home link. Ooh. So you end up with, because it's like, site.com/home and then site.com/es/home. And so it looks at that and goes, oh, ES is home and home is home. And so it says home, whatever. And so there's a little bit of code to like strip out that secondary home menu breadcrumb. And I wonder if that's what causes, the cache to break sometimes.
Right.
But I can test what happens if there's more than one. But I would suspect it's just I think if I remember right, when I'm looking at the code, it's just the first match. And the question is the first match based on menu ID or is it based on hierarchy? You could always get around it too by having the second one be a hard link that just redirects.
Right. That's a good point.
But you would have the issue of if somebody get there through the laboratory, they would then see the breadcrumb as the career section.
Yeah. Is that kind of confusing? Right.
Yeah. So they have to use the back button rather than the breadcrumb to get back there. But those are generally edge cases. And to be honest, most of my clients just say like, you know what, we're just okay with a little bit of ambiguity there. Because the truth is, on a page with 10,000 sites, if there's only 10 pages that have that weirdness, then is it worth building out a whole custom thing?
All right. Before we move into our primary topic, a update to our newsletter to talk about big and exciting. We are adding Abby's Game of the Week section to the newsletter. Today is Abby's second to last show as guest host, but she'll be joining us every other week moving forward in the newsletter with game reviews, recommendations. Abby, what types of games will you be reviewing?
So kind of this to start out, will be a lot of stuff I've mentioned in these shows, but it's going to be a mix of PC games, Switch, PlayStation games, because those are the consoles I have, and then board games. I'm a little light on new favorite board games right now. I played them a ton before the pandemic and now not so much, but there's a few good board game adaptations on Steam, especially that you can play with friends virtually. So I will have some of those recommendations coming up too. It'll be a surprise each week.
I know you have a fond love of Monopoly. I played both Monopoly and Monopoly Junior over the weekend with my kids.
It's the worst board game.
Yeah, Monopoly is a horrible,
literally
as far as the game
worst,
goes, it's a terrible
so much fun
game.
Especially with a 9-year-old. He's like doing math, like awesome. It was great.
When I was a kid and playing Monopoly, I was the oldest cousin of 8, and I literally kept a notebook. And so they would lose all their money and I would make them go into debt with me and continue playing. And I just like kept a ledger of how much money they owed me. And I wouldn't let them stop till I owned everything along the board.
Well, no wonder you don't like it.
Jeez. It's no challenge, right?
When you
that's the way to
destroy a game like that. I mean,
no, just it literally has bad design principles for a game. For example, I digress, but very quickly. For example, games need to have a comeback feature. Monopoly does not have one. Games need to have, like for example, the biggest problem with Monopoly is once you start losing, you know you're going to lose. There's no way to come back, but there's still 30 turns to go.
That's why free parking exists, man.
No. Free parking isn't a comeback. Free parking just delays you losing a little bit longer. But once you start to lose, you cannot come back.
I don't know about that. Like, I feel like I have hit free parking for like, $1,000, $1,500 and been like, oh, I'm back.
No. Okay. So first of all, that's not a rule in Monopoly.
That's a house rule.
It is a house rule.
Cash,
true.
And that still just prolongs it because you get $1,500, but if you don't own hotels and somebody else owns hotels, you're still going to lose.
You're just going to pay them rent more.
Well, so I mean, I guess like you bartering, like, and creating deals is that another house rule? Or
just play Catan, John. Catan's way better.
Yeah. Monopoly was literally created as a commentary on capitalism and how once you start winning, you win and losers lose.
It's not fair.
Now free parking prolongs it because if you follow the actual rules, the game only usually lasts about 20 minutes, half an hour. But I digress.
So, dear listener, if you are interested in hearing more about the actual game review and less about the opinions of this panel, keep on listening, and you can learn how to join our newsletter to hear about Abby's game reviews.
So, moving on to our primary topic, which I'm very excited to talk about. Laura, can you kind of give us the high-level view? How'd you get started with website management, and when did you first encounter Drupal?
Sure. So I started out of college, was actually an art major with a minor in education, and I started working at a university. My husband was in grad school. We moved to a small university town. And so I started working at the academic library. And I think academic libraries are like this wonderful hidden secret of super interesting, smart technology people. Because the reality is like libraries have been at the forefront of all this different technology stuff. And so I was doing public affairs and communications stuff. And we were redoing the library and we were building a bunch of new spaces. And as part of that, we also started redesigning the website for the library. And they had some folks on staff who built and maintained the website, and they were using Drupal. And I was like, oh, what's that? And we were actually, the university was really big. And so some people had old kind of static sites built in CSS. And then we were sort of like trying this new thing with Drupal. So I really have never worked on a website. My very first website that I worked on was in fact Drupal, which I think is pretty unusual. And I just was so appreciative that like they took the time to kind of explain stuff to me. And that got me really interested. I realized I really liked the digital communication. I really liked the tools. I really liked helping people figure out like, you have a problem you need to solve, and here are these tools. What can these tools do? How can we like match up what you need to solve with the appropriate tool? So went back to grad school. I focused in digital comms. And then I moved to DC. And so at DC, I worked for 2 different universities. The first one did not use Drupal. And then the next one did. And actually, I started going to the Drupal GovCon because the community of folks who do Drupal at universities, there's usually a couple people at each university, even if it's a large university. So there's not a lot of community necessarily at each university. You kind of have to seek out other people who have similar jobs and are experiencing similar challenges. And because I was in DC and at a university and Drupal GovCon is free and open, I was able to go to that. And that was just really awesome to kind of connect with this much larger community of Drupal folks. But yeah, so now I work at USPTO. And we are a Drupal shop, and I've been there about 7.5 years. Yeah, it's been great. I would say I manage the team, but I don't consider myself a Drupal developer.
Well, that's fine. Even Drupal developers need managers. So, and the Drupal community has a variety of different folks in it. So you each manage a Drupal team. Abby, let's start with you. Can you just explain a little bit about the project and or about your project and how it's using Drupal?
Yeah. So the main sites my team works on are atf.gov, which if you go to it now, that's the Drupal 7 site. In the background, we are busy building the Drupal 9 site and migration upgrade. And then we've got a smaller internal only site in Drupal 9 that's basically a employee image library. So our photographers and videographers, when they take photos at events, they can share or headshots of leadership, logos and seals. All of that can be in one place for employees to access. So that was a smaller Drupal project, but the main meat of what we do is the atf.gov.
Cool. And what size team and what composition of team at a high level do you have working on that?
Yeah. So we have 3 full-time developers who are contractors, and then we have 4 federal employees and me. And so 2 of those are more of the kind of project management and content specialists. So they're kind of the techier side. And 2 are writer editors who are they're still in Drupal putting the content in, but most of their time is writing that original content.
Cool. Laura, same question to you. What project are you using Drupal on? And then what is the team composition that you're overseeing?
Sure. So the main uspto.gov website uses Drupal. We just recently upgraded to Drupal 9. There's also developer.uspto.gov. And that is kind of a hub for all of our open data, where we want people to download and remix our data. And then the project that I'm really excited about that's just about to come out is we are redoing our intranet, which is very old school technology, and we're moving it into Drupal. So we've kind of got 3 different flavors. We've got 2 external sites with slightly different audiences, and then an internal, and they're all built on Drupal.
So question before you jump into your team, the developer.uspto.gov, does that have an API where you can get into that data, or is it all like content text-based data sharing?
So it does have APIs. And I would encourage folks, if you like intellectual property data, to go explore. We have a ton of data. We needed places where researchers and other people could go download it, pull it. There's some Tableau visualizations to kind of give people some ideas of cool things they can do with the data. One of the things we really like in the communications office is very helpful is there's some really cool visualizations about, for example, like what technologies are commonly getting patents in particular states and particular states over time. So you can see like some like Washington state, for example, like if you look at the turn of the century in the 40s and the 50s, like you see a lot of like agricultural and like forestry related patents. And then of course you see this huge shift where there's like a ton of technology patents. So there's some cool stuff you can do with the data. We've tried to make it a bit more accessible and definitely worth like poking around and kind of seeing what is out there in case it's something that's interesting.
Very cool. Nick, wait until the end of the show to start accessing that API. Okay. I can see you like, oh, come on. API is cool. So let's shift back to the team composition. What size team are you leading on this effort?
Sure. So we have 3 teams because of those 3 products. So the developer.usp2.gov is primarily a contractor. That's a smaller team of about 3 or 4 people. USP2.gov is a bit of a bigger team. It's a mixture of contractors and feds. We have 2 to 3, depending on what year and what we're doing, 2 to 3 developers, and then we have 2 or 3 federal folks. Some of them are developers or they have sort of project management kind of roles. And on USP2.gov, we also have 180 authors. So we have just a ton of people that can potentially add content to the site. And then on the intranet, we have again, like 2 or 3 developers. It's a smallish team, and we're trying to figure out kind of how many authors should we have, because potentially anybody in our 13,000 person agency might have, for example, like a news item that they want to share with the agency. So we're trying to figure out how to not have 13,000 authors necessarily.
So I'm curious what might be unique about leading a team in government versus, the private sector or academia. Maybe we can start with you, Laura, because you've worked in both academia and in the government. What's something that kind of stands out as different managing those teams?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of variables that are sort of predetermined when you're designing something in government. So there's a variety of kind of rules and standards that any government agency has to follow, whether it's accessibility or if it's related to cybersecurity. So you already kind of know certain boundaries of things you're definitely going to have to do. Even if you're releasing like a very small new feature, it still has to have meet all of those requirements. Universities, again, like they're trying towards those standards. But it's not a requirement with actual like law in many cases behind it. So I also think that the appetite for risk between a university and government can be different. So, we are America's innovation agency, we like to say, and we want to be very innovative. But that said, in government, I think people can naturally become very risk adverse. So I think part of it is like creating ways for people to try things and to put out new work. And to build on good success. And that helps give, I think, people who are maybe kind of risk averse or a little nervous, more confidence in what we're doing. Whereas I think in the universities, it is a culture of, constantly doing research, constantly trying things. And in the academic culture, if you're coming up with an experiment, part of what you want to do is you don't want to do an experiment. You want to write your experiment such that no matter what happens, you learn something. So if it's successful the way you think it will be, you will learn something. But if it's not successful the way you thought it would be, you also learn something. And I think that's something that government can always learn from, which is it's not that we shouldn't be experimenting. It's that no matter how we set things up, if it goes, the way we thought or a different way, we're going to learn something and kind of move it forward. So I think there's some like cultural differences. And I think like the tolerance for risk, I think it's a much more publicly noticeable. If you have a major government site that has a problem. So I think that's why sometimes government can be very cautious. And so it's figuring out how to create that culture where it's okay to take risks, because either way, you're going to be moving forward. You're going to be learning something.
How about you, Abby? what do you think is unique about leading a team, at the ATF, that kind of is one of the big portals to the public, right? I think both of you kind of have that unique position. So what's unique about running a project for the government?
So for me, my whole career's been in government, right? So I can kind of talk to what I think is unique, but I'm also interested, Nick and John, if anything pops out to you. But one thing that I think is both kind of a pro and a con, right, is that with government budget cycles, things are locked in years in advance. And so when we're in the middle of especially for agile development, that makes it kind of rough, because if we need to scale up or scale down, it's very hard to do that mid-year or mid 5-year contract. You're kind of locked into these chunks, and that money is set aside pretty early. So I think what difference that makes for my team especially is level of efforts become everything. The time becomes the really critical thing, because you have your devs, you have them full-time all year, you know exactly how much time you have, and it's just a matter of what can you build within that time, and how do you handle priorities as they shift throughout the year. And so I think we'll talk about that a bit later, but new executive orders come out, right? A new administration comes in, a new person heads up your agency and wants to change everything up. So you have to be able to, with the resources you have, shift pretty quickly and try to reorder your backlog, right? Make sure that you're meeting everyone's needs with the set amount of resources you have.
I mean, from my perspective, I think one of the things you mentioned that really stands out is that there's regulation, there's law behind some of the requirements. I imagine things like ADA compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And
Section
I think that
508.
And I think there's a lot of relief in that, because it's just something that you have to do. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to make a case for it. You can just do it. But I guess one of the big questions that I have as an outsider kind of looking in is, what happens when you have competing priorities? Like, both are like a requirement by law. You have to get something out, whether it's a news release or something, but you just don't have the resources allocated. Like, I imagine, for most businesses, if something like that happens where it's like, hey, we just need, this has to happen in the next 3 months, they'll allocate more budget for it. You might get some outside help, an outside contractor, cover overtime or something. But I imagine those kinds of choices sometimes just aren't available. So how do you navigate that? Abby, how would you navigate something like that?
So I think there's a little bit of, if we do have budget available, and that's if you guys at all live near the DC area, you'll see a lot of news stories about, right, continuing resolutions, the budget cycle. Basically, there's only a couple months in the year where we actually have a real budget, and the rest of the year it's locked down because Congress hasn't approved the budget yet. So that system is kind of broken. And that means in theory, right, midway through a contract, if we do have a real bona fide need, we could add more money onto that contract. We could modify it and ramp up. But in reality, we end up not really being able to do that. So instead, it really is, I think, making those hard choices of what we can build or not. My team really tries to focus hard on MVPs, right? What is knowing that there could be unexpected stuff coming down the pipe later, trying to build kind of the minimally viable product that we can at a time, and try to keep focus so we can get something at least to a state where it's done enough to be used and to be useful to people. So that if we need to suddenly shift to something else, it's in a state that it can kind of sit and hang out for a while with just minimal maintenance.
Interesting.
So that's how we approach it.
And I think MVP is like a good thing to think about, because in some ways, MVP in a government context, the things you have to have, you're going to have more things probably that you have to have,
right,
to get to MVP. But I also agree with Abby, like, in that culture of like, it has to be perfect, that can kind of bump up against like the agile mindset. So that's something, at least I spend a lot of time thinking about, like, how do I expose my executives or my decision makers to that agile mindset with this idea of, yes, let's like keep making incremental improvements. Yes, you might see something that you're like, oh, this would be another good thing to add to this. And like, we have those conversations of like, well, we could get something out right now and it'll give you, 30%. we also need to like acknowledge, like we understand what 100% looks like, but let's give you 30 and then 30 and then 30 and then the last 3 and then you'll be at 100, rather than sometimes in government, I think like, again, folks want it to be absolutely perfect before it comes out, and people can start using it. And that is just naturally kind of in conflict with that idea of incremental improvement.
Perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Right. But that risk adverse thing plays into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Iteration, I feel like iteration is naturally like it's not something that the government really embraces. Right.
I've seen I see a lot of conversations about how to do agile in government, right? How to write a web development service contract that embraces agile and allows for it. So I think it's definitely somewhere that it wasn't even 10 years ago. We're in a whole different world where I'd say probably most web teams in government want to be agile. That might look different depending on your agency, the level of security around your product, but
sure.
It's at least the value is recognized, and there's a lot of discussion daily, right, on how to best do that.
Something they're warming to, right?
Right.
I definitely think within the web teams, at least at our agency, like very focused on that agile mindset. And there's a ton of training that goes on, like within the CIOs group, very supportive for agile. I think the thing that we're now trying to think about is how do we bring non-techies, non-CIO folks, the leaders into that conversation. Sure. A leader of an agency doesn't necessarily need to, nor would I expect them to, if they're heading an agency, they're probably based on their qualifications for leading that agency, not like how much do they know about technology. Mm-hmm. But I think it is useful for them to know up front, like we're always making these trade-offs. And so there may come a time where there's a new thing you want us to do, and we may bring to you the things we were planning on doing and ask for your help in determining where does your new priority or this new requirement kind of fit in. So we're trying to be more mindful about, like, I think originally it was this feeling of, oh, if you as an executive, like you probably don't need to know about, all the details. We kind of insulated them from some of the details, but I think it is helpful. What we're seeing is to have those conversations before there's hard choices, to be like, this is always a series of trade-offs. Behind the scenes, we're always making these trade-offs. And there may come a time when we need some help and some guidance in determining what the right trade-offs are in this particular situation. And that way they're not surprised when you kind of get to that point to say, hey, actually, we can do 10 items and we have 15 items. So we think these are the 10 that are most important, but can you validate it for us?
So something you talked about briefly there for a second, and before we jump into kind of like building the actual and maintaining the actual team, right? I'm curious, obviously, based on the conversation we're having right now, you two are friends outside of work, right? But I'm wondering, like, and you're both at equivalent levels within different organizations kind of doing the same thing. I'm wondering, like, how much collaboration happens between, the two of you, or in general, people at kind of the web chief level, to talk about some of these problems and to kind of like brainstorm, issues and do, the different organizations kind of share tactics in that regard.
So I can answer this, take a stab at it. So Laura and I actually met because we were collaborating as part of work. And so that it is probably another thing that makes government pretty unique is that there's no competition and everyone is thrilled to share their taxpayer funded code, right? Their approach, have coffee with you and talk you through what they're doing. Everyone is so open to doing that, even with people they haven't met, because you're a Fed, I'm a Fed, we are in this together. We're all trying to serve the public. And so that is probably what I love most about the job, and why I'm still in government, right, for my whole career, because I can't imagine losing that sense of community and public service, which is just kind of unmatched.
As a taxpayer, I appreciate you guys reusing each other's work so I don't have to pay more. That makes a lot of sense. Laura, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that within the various like cabinet level agencies, I think there's more crossover. There's, some structure. So Abby and I both worked for the Department of Commerce. And there were various structures that had us getting together as, the web council. And by bringing those folks together, by having an email list, even though a lot of those bureaus are located in different places, we aren't in the same building. You knew that you had this community that you could reach out to. And it's true that a lot of the technical or communications challenges are not specific to any one agency. So if you're dealing with the public and you're trying to help them, fill out a form, which is necessary to do a government thing, like everyone in government has that challenge, generally speaking. So yes, your specific form, why they're filling it out, like those details may change, but if you can come up with a good way, helping people, explaining the process, helping people navigate, getting done what they need to do, like that is very replicable. So I definitely feel like that is actually a difference from universities. Like at universities, you all have the same problem, but at the end of the day, although they are very open, like there is competition between universities for students, for faculty, et cetera. Whereas the government, it's like, hey, you want to, file your taxes and, get a patent, like that, the more the merrier, really, like take advantage of these services. So that is definitely good. I do think it's tough when you talk across the government because it is so large. And I think one of the things that's really challenging is how do you get folks together and get them together without having it be too unwieldy. So I think one of the challenges is like the most effective groups that I've been part of have been fairly small. They've been like under 10 people. We tend to be kind of at similar levels, working on similar things, but at different agencies. And there's a lot of like cross-pollination. If that group was 100 people, I don't necessarily know that it would be as effective because it's a really small group and we've gotten to know each other and you kind of know like, okay, this person's going to have, a very unorthodox approach. This is the person I'm going to ask questions about if I want like the by the book approach. Whereas with a big group, there's more people, but potentially you have to kind of figure out who the right people to go to are. So that's a question of like, how do you get these groups to be more available to more people throughout the government? And I did a detail at Maine Commerce at the cabinet level commerce office. And so I got exposed to a bunch of groups that as someone working at the USPTO, I didn't have access to before. And that was really eye-opening of like, wow, there's this whole other layer of people talking about things that are directly, trickle down relevant to my job that I never had access to. And I didn't even know existed until I was in this sort of new context. And I was like, oh, you're in this context. So you're part of this group over here. So how do we keep people continuing to mix ideas, share ideas, and mix across the silos and the groups?
It's almost like we need a Drupal specific, government specific conference in the DC area
so
that everybody could come to. Of course, I'm joking. GovCon is wonderful. If you've never gone and you're in government, you should go. So shameless plug.
We're not in government, right?
Or not. I'm not in government. I'm not in government.
Free.
I've gone.
Yep.
It's amazing. So yeah, go to GovCon. Shameless plug. There you go.
I think it might be the biggest camp outside of DrupalCon, maybe in the US, but
I've heard that.
Yeah.
That camp might still beat it, but
pre-pandemic we were over 1,000 folks per year, but yeah, I'm not sure how bad camp.
Pretty close.
But we're free.
I do think though, one of the challenges with any of the conferences is because we're so focused on getting product out the door, like getting folks to take the time to package up what they've done and consider applying for a conference or consider, doing some of these sort of community building activities. I think that can be kind of hard sometimes at government. So like, I think if you are a web shop, like you want to be out there talking about what you're doing so that you can get more business. It's a very clear, like obvious reason why it's worth taking the time to kind of go out and promote what you're doing. I think that the line is less clear, but it's still important. And so I think that can sometimes also be a challenge. Like I really have had to push my teams to say like explicitly, not only do I want you to develop this thing for us, but when you're developing it, you should be thinking about contributing it back. And I think if you don't explicitly encourage that, I think it's very easy to just kind of get into your silo and work on your thing and make sure that your immediate team is happy and not be thinking about how can I share this or contribute it back.
Sounds like a GovCon pop-up event during the next government shutdown could be a good solution for that, right?
Instead of staying home and watching Netflix, can all come meet up.
Like don't Netflix and chill. Go to a GovCon pop-up. Okay,
right.
Let's jump into kind of like team mechanics, right? So you're both guiding Drupal teams in government, and I'm interested to hear kind of how you develop a strong team of obviously a multidisciplinary team, and specifically also how you build a strong team that's not 100% government employees, right? Because you guys have a certain amount of contractors working with you as well. So Abby, why don't we we're going to let Laura go first. Abby answered the first couple of questions. So the question,
sure.
if I can summarize, how do you build and maintain a strong team in government? There it is.
So I think you're absolutely right that when you have these mixed teams, before getting to government, I only ever knew teams that were just employees, like employees of the university. Mm-hmm. We really didn't do contractors. And we have a lot of mixed teams, and there's a lot of nice benefits to having those mixed teams in government. It gives you some of that flexibility, as we mentioned, that can be really hard sometimes with the way that we plan things out. We're really fortunate, and we've had kind of a core group of contractors for years and years and years. And so, I think that we don't draw that much of a distinction between the contractors and the federal staff. Although there are at some times it will sort of assert itself, there are just sort of like weird things that you have to be mindful of in terms of like what kind of access contractors can have to certain things. But I think to the extent that you just treat everyone like we're all on the same team, I think that is very helpful for building the team. And then I think part of it too is just really getting to know all the personalities on your team. So, there's a lot of different ways you can kind of like lump people together: contractors, federal folks, introverts, extroverts, but really like putting all of that aside, like get to know each individual person on your team, because if you're working with those team members, you're going to have to know like who has a tendency to be overly optimistic in how long they think something is going to take, or who gets really nervous about bringing you bad news. And you just kind of really need to know the individual quirks of the members of your team. And so the more time you can spend with them. Prior to the pandemic, we were a co-located team, and I think that can be really helpful. But really kind of getting to know everybody. And I know some of the folks on my team, they have been here ever since I started. So I've seen their children go from toddlers to high school students. So I think really getting to know your team is the biggest thing, no matter where you are.
So it seems like longevity is important there, right? So like, I guess when a lot of people think of like outside contractors, they think of like this person comes in, fixes a problem, and then they go off and like they're never seen again. But it sounds like, and Abby, I'll let you speak to this a little bit, but it sounds like in your situations that the contractors are very long-term employees, and you kind of just, it's a team. You built a team, and now that team is executing on, whatever the project might be.
Absolutely. And I think that has been true both at Commerce and at ATF. For me, what I've seen is the contractors are there for the long haul, which is a huge benefit to us, because, and often they'll actually go, like you might award to a different contractor, but the devs will be hired by the new contractor. So they'll kind of stay cross contract. And it's a huge benefit to the government because they understand the mission. They understand the acronyms. They get how government works and the processes to go through. They get Section 508, right? There's all those things that are kind of special and wonky about government. And once a developer gets that and gets to know an agency and your team, you're so much more effective with that time that is the most critical thing, right? So there is other ways of contracting out for your website, right? I think some agencies, especially for like a migration, right, might just basically hire an outside company to do everything. And the company just asks the government for the requirements, but then they go off and do it all separately and basically come back to the government to show them progress during the way. And that's not my favorite approach. I think it's a much stronger team when the feds and the contractors are in constant communication about requirements. So for my team, we do a daily scrum, 15-minute scrum every morning that has both the devs and the content admins in the meeting. Because the content admins can bring up, you know what, I cannot get, edit.atf.gov to load today. And the devs are like, oh, wait, let me just try this and see what's going on. It's, they'll say, we're writing a new feature story about X. The devs might have an idea. Vice versa, the devs could say, we're working on the Spanish site, and a content admin might pop up and say, hey, in Drupal 7, we have this issue. Is that something that we might be able to fix in Drupal 9? So by having that level of comfort and constant communication across the two, I think we build so much of a stronger product for citizens. So that might be my one tip, right? And as Laura alluded to, there are definitely rules in place for contractors versus feds. And sometimes they're really crappy and they feel not great. Like a contractor can't come to the holiday party, right? Unless they get special permission. So but those things aside, I think it really does feel like a single team.
So just a follow-up question there, right? So you talked about kind of like external teams working on like smaller like pieces, right? I'm assuming that you both, have your core teams, and like though maybe you use those external teams in some cases, and that's managed by the core team. Is that like a fair assessment?
So I think for us, we go into every planning cycle knowing that we do capacity planning, and it's some combination of federal folks and contractors. So we really don't just sort of hire wholesale, like a whole team, and then bring them in and have like a manager who's a Fed manage that. We have really integrated teams. Part of that too is, again, like there's a lot of different things in terms of getting people set up. So even just like getting the technology to work, getting everyone who is a contractor being able to connect to where they need to connect to, and being able to push code where they need to push code, it can take several weeks. So if you're doing, a yearly contract and you lose a month or you lose a month and a half, that is a significant amount of overhead. So there is a lot of benefit in that having that continuity, both in terms of people's actual institutional knowledge, but then also this idea of you're removing some of that startup overhead if you have a lot of churn with new people coming in.
It's awesome, because it sounds like both of you are very focused on long-term knowledge base and making sure that your teams both have a very, very good understanding of what they're building, which, I think whether it's government or private sector or education, like that's super important to the end product and making sure that the end product is going to work for the end user. So
I've also seen with those ideas of like the sort of a la carte teams, and I haven't seen this in government, but I've seen this elsewhere. Like if you buy like a team and their knowledge for a period of time, you may hit this period towards the end where they kind of know like this site is not going to be something I have to be thinking about anymore after like next month, right? And so there can be stuff at the end where you're like, this is an issue, it needs to get fixed. And rather than solving it for the long term, I think it is easy to fall into the trap of like, I'm just going to solve this for now, and then if it breaks in 2 years, this isn't my site anymore. Whereas when you have folks who know they're going to be working on this site, again, like the incentives are aligned such that even if it's a thorny problem, and we've had some stuff like this, it took a while to really get to a good, stable place. People are very motivated to do it because they know that they're solving the future version of themselves' problem, and that will pay off in the long run.
Yeah, so I have a question about, the government kind of does move a little slowly sometimes, and there's some advantages to that, but I'm curious about how much flexibility you guys have over technology that your teams use, whether that's Drupal versus another web platform or Linux versus Mac. Is that something that you guys have any flexibility over? Is there approvals you have to get through? How does that work?
Yeah. So in our case, I think we're lucky enough to be flexible. I really do think it depends on your agency and then how much your CIO shop is involved in those decisions. And if you already have a stack of MacBook Pros at the ready, right, that's what you're going to give to your dev contractors to use. But when you are buying new stuff, we were actually able to allow our devs to pick. We had to upgrade. We had old MacBook Pros. It was time to upgrade anyway. And about half the team was interested in using Linux laptops instead of MacBooks. And these are not on the regular agency network, right? They're kind of separate development computers just used for development. It doesn't touch anything sensitive like our main government laptops do. So we had the freedom to say, yes, you can choose between two kind of similar machines for Linux or Mac. And they also, we have enough kind of using both that they're able to troubleshoot. If something like if there's a Mac specific issue, there's at least two people with Macs that can troubleshoot that.
Abby,
so that's been good.
Use an acronym there, CIO shop. Can you?
Yeah, it's the IT shop. It's the Chief Information Officer shop. So every agency has that. Web teams are kind of funky. They can sometimes live inside that piece of the agency, and sometimes they live in public affairs, and sometimes there's kind of pieces of the team in both places that work together.
Interesting. Laura, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm working in that environment where like half the team is in the comm shop and half the team is in the CIO shop. Because I think we are such a large agency, and there's been a move to really standardize over the last few years. We at the agency have like standard images and kind of standardized tech stacks. So it's good in that you know exactly kind of what the limitations are, and you don't go kind of herring off investigating something that you can't use. It does mean that you have to get very creative, like within your box. You have to get very creative within your box. So we do have some things like emulators. But yes, we as an agency, because we develop not just web stuff, but we also develop all the transactional systems for filing and paying for patents and trademarks. They have a standardized stack that everyone uses.
Interesting. So I'm wondering, when a new team member, there's a need for a new team member, right? You have hired that person, whether it's a federal employee or a contractor, right? What does the onboarding process look like for your two agencies? And are they different? Are they the same? Like, can we talk about that a little bit? Abby, why don't you go first?
Sure. So I think in both cases, right, I try to, especially in the beginning, like Laura said, it can be weeks, month that they don't have access to all the systems they need to actually do stuff. With virtual learning, it's pretty easy to just hop on Teams with someone, do some over the shoulder training, right? So I usually come up with a schedule of here's different people across the team who are particularly good or knowledgeable about X. You're going to take an hour, kind of ride side saddle with them. They're going to talk through what they're doing on a given day. That type of job shadowing, hopping around. So that I found useful, and it's easier to kind of do in advance. I think for us, we have SOPs. The dev ones are much more up to date sometimes than the content ones. And so depending on, those are useful documents, but it just does not beat talking live with a person who does this every day and asking your questions, right? That can't be replaced by document.
Sure. Interesting.
So some of these artifacts, like we have a developer's handbook, which, if someone isn't quite yet ready to start actually doing things, the first thing is like, go read kind of the handbook. The nice thing about the handbook, I have a poor memory, so I need to like write everything down. And so the nice thing about the handbook is over time, if there are decisions that were made or sort of quirky things, we've added sections to that handbook. And just sitting and reading it through is a great first start, because then if a new person has questions, they can go to someone else on the team. But they can also have some of that institutional knowledge that they would be lacking as a new person. The other thing I always tell new people is, as a new person, you have this really unique skill of being able to see and notice things that don't make sense to you. And you have that unique skill for like a couple months, but then eventually you kind of get acclimatized and you lose that kind of sensitivity. So I always tell people, like, on one hand, I think as new people, if you hire a good person, they really want to jump in there and start working. And can be a little frustrating if they're not quite set up to start working yet. But I always tell them, like, on the flip side, you have something right now that is completely unique, which is like, take notes on anything that seems odd or inefficient or kind of strange to you, because we, as people who've been here a long time, we are not sensitized. We have lost that skill to notice those things. So I also always encourage people, like, make the most of your newness, and like that's a unique thing that only a new person can do, in addition to kind of getting up to speed. So like, yes, you don't have the institutional knowledge yet, but you have this other really unique thing, which is those fresh set of eyes.
So this is a weird question, so I apologize, but I just had this thought. Abby was saying that, it can take, weeks or months sometimes before somebody can get access and get like onboarded, right? And obviously you guys are taking steps in that time frame to, acclimate this person. And they've gone through an employment, employment process. But I'm wondering, as a new employee, or as somebody who's joining one of your teams, whether contractor or federal employee, whatever, is there some sort of like tryout period or probationary period, as where like, hey, in the first 90 days, you're on probation, and like, we could say, this isn't really working out, or like, you might say, it's not really working out. Like, I'm just curious about that.
For feds, it depends. A lot of federal positions will have a 1-year probationary period, but when you're applying, it will say that pretty clearly on USA Jobs. But that is kind of an exception where it still has to be justified and documented. It's not completely at will. It has to have documented reasons, but an agency could say within that first calendar year, this isn't working out for a federal employee. And then for contractors are much more at will, right? So if that relationship isn't working out and that contractor is not performing, usually that's the contracting rep talks with the company and says, hey, this particular contractor, we've seen these issues. The contractor will have a chance to remediate with them, right?
Sure.
Because they manage them. It's not the gov who manages them, right? So the company would talk to that developer, try to improve things and work things out. If it's still not working out, then the company would bring in someone else. That other person might be reassigned to something else that company oversees, right? So they have the flexibility to move that person to something that is maybe a better fit for them.
That makes sense.
But there's no kind of period where that ends. That's kind of contracting. That's how it works.
It's part of being a contractor.
Right.
So one thing I'm curious about is how you manage content editors, both within and outside of your immediate team. And it sounds like you guys both have to have slightly different approaches. So Laura, I guess one of the things that you mentioned, that it might've been pre-show, but you mentioned that there's 13,000 people in the agency that potentially would have information that they'd want to post to the site. So how do you manage training those content editors and how to both enter the content or compile the content? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so I would say, we started with our public site, and our public site has about 180 authors. And truly, if I was in charge of everything, we probably would have slightly fewer authors, because 180 authors is a lot of authors. And one of the things we always look at is, one, how much training do you need to be good at what we're asking you to do? And also, how often do you have to do it? So if you got trained, and you're at peak awareness, great. But if then you don't use those skills regularly, you get out of practice. So one of the things that I try to push with our folks is really only getting folks that need to use the system. I usually say at least once a month, because if you're using at least once a month, then the training kind of sticks better. But yes, we have a lot of authors, and we've had to build up governance. And a big thing when I came in was this idea of kind of professionalizing this group of people. So I think a lot of places the web was sort of an afterthought, or putting content on the web was kind of an afterthought, and it got kind of tossed into someone's job, like, oh, you run the mimeograph machine, and you also put some content on the website. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to professionalize that work. We wanted to codify what doing a good job at that work looked like, and also kind of create a culture within our agency, because we have so many people that do it, where they could learn from each other, and they could see also career pathways. So if maybe you started of having this extra duty as assigned, we meet every month. There's always like a training component to the meetings. There's also kind of a demo component of any new features, so people can be learning about how to take full advantage of the site. And then we also have different departments do kind of a show and tell, something that they've recently improved. And that's great because you can learn from the other people, and you might see something that is like, oh, that's a good idea. I could take that back to my department and use it. But it also leads to a little bit of a spirit of competition of like, ooh, I want to make sure my department is, as up to speed and cool as this other department over there. So we wanted to kind of professionalize a bunch of those roles when historically they were sort of an afterthought. And so we have sort of a whole governance structure around that, where we do monthly trainings. We actually wrote into an executive order some required training every year, so that we could actually, hold people accountable for attending various things like the 508 training. That's really important. And if people aren't using the system, or they aren't going to training, we have the ability to kind of take that responsibility away from them. But yeah, with this many authors, it's really challenging. And so some of it comes down to just constant training, and also putting groups of folks together so that they can learn from each other. Because at any given time, with that many people, there's some people who've been working on the system for a while, and some people who are very, very new.
So as we bring the show to a close here, I'm curious, you're both leading, web teams for Drupal. We've stated that numerous times. I'm wondering, like, if you had, one or two like key pieces of advice for two different people, right? Somebody who's looking to join a team like yours that works on a government website, or somebody who's in, your similar position, guiding a government team building Drupal websites. Like, what would that piece of advice be? Abby, why don't you go first?
Sure. So for the first group of folks, like if you're interested in help build a government website, I would say it looks really intimidating at first, the government contractor landscape. But a lot of times two companies will go together to jointly bid on a government contract. So you can look through, there's sites like GSA Advantage that list companies that frequently do business with the government and have set price lists. And they're usually always looking for developer resumes to work on different projects as they come up. So if you're a single developer, you could look through those companies, put your resume out there. They're always hungry for new folks. If you're a small company, right, and you're interested in starting to, or a big company and interested in starting to work on government contracts, you could find a partner company who's done it before and is already in the system and work with them to jointly bid. And then you have the benefit of their experience, and you're getting your foot in the door and learning the ropes. My advice for someone managing a team, something that I'm still internalizing and working on, is not trying to do things yourself. I love site builder stuff, and I love that kind of thing. But the biggest thing as a manager for me is sit back. That's what your team is for. Give them the space and the tools and the help they need to do it. But your job is to bust down obstacles as they come up for them, and kind of keep an eye on the overall picture and keep the team moving forward together. But your job is not to go, like build out a whole ticket yourself. You need to step back, right? And that's hard.
Delegation is hard, right?
It's hard because I love messing with the tech stuff. So that's been my challenge, but also I think it's really important.
Laura, what about you?
I would say for people at our kind of where we sit, I think the big thing is there's always stuff that needs to be done at your agency, but it's really important not to shortchange the sharing of the ideas, the like going to getting out of your silo, going to events where you're going to get to meet other people, be exposed to other ideas. That's something I think you really have to like put on your calendar and make a priority, because it's important for the overall health of the community, but it's not necessarily something that is explicitly rewarded within your job, because a lot of it is about like, what have you delivered? So it's like good foundational stuff. So I would say, like, other folks out there in the government, like, please share your stuff. Please show off your stuff. Like, you've probably solved some issue that everybody else is trying to figure out. Like, please share that. Even though it takes a little bit of time to kind of put something together, even if it's not even fully formed, that's okay. I think, again, in the government, we really like strive for perfection, and sometimes we just have to get over that and just start sharing earlier.
So Laura, Abby talked about, like, if I wanted to become a contractor for the government, like, but I'm wondering specifically, like, if I wanted to become a federal employee working on a web team, like, how would I go about doing that?
I can take this one. So all US jobs are pasted on usajobs.gov. So every federal job. And I have a very unusual story in terms of how I entered the government. And I tell people this story because it is so unusual that I think people, it's just so counterintuitive to what people expect. So a lot of people will say, you go on to USA Jobs, and I submitted all these resumes, and I never heard anything back, or I never got out of, that first sort of pull of who are we going to interview. But I think the big differentiator is really carefully reading the job postings and really tailoring all of your materials to the job postings. Different agencies do it differently, but basically, when your resume goes in, and USA Jobs has done a really good job, actually, they have a nice video on kind of how to write your resume, but whether it's through computer automated or a human being, they look at your resume and they look at what that job is hiring for. And if you don't clearly articulate how you are qualified for that job, the system, it's not going to fill in the blanks for you. So you really have to clearly articulate how, demonstrate that you can do the job. And that is one of the most important things getting through that first pass. For me, I wasn't actively looking for a job in government. USPTO happens to be very close to my house. I happened to go there on a weekend. We have this amazing museum. And when I went there, I was just blown away. And I was like, wow, I'm working in universities. I'm helping all these professors like get the word out about their cool, innovations, research, etc. And that's what this agency does. Except for it's also super close to my house. So I was like very interested in, like, if they're ever hiring, I'm very interested. So you can also set up a little alert. So for example, not all the positions will mention Drupal. They might just say CMS. That's actually something I try when we're hiring. I try to make sure we include Drupal, because that's a really relevant thing. Is like, if you actually do this work, you want to know what CMS we're talking about. But again, not all the jobs are written that way. So you want to have keywords, and you can set up an alert, and then it'll email you when there's a job that matches your criteria. So I got an email that basically was this job that sounded exactly like what I was doing, but in the government instead of at the university. And I just spent hours and hours writing that one resume, really polishing it, getting it like perfected as much as I could. And so for me, I wrote one resume, I applied to one job, I went to an interview, I went to a second interview, they gave me an offer. I tell people this because that is not most people's experience, but it can happen. And I do think that the key to kind of getting through that process is really reading carefully, really intuiting what it is that somebody needs in this position, and then showing in your materials exactly your experience, showing you could do that job.
The one line that got you in your resume was, can walk to work in a snowstorm. They were like,
right.
I have done that. I have walked to work in a snowstorm. Yes.
Oh, I know. I can see it. I can see that being very beneficial.
Well, Abby and Laura, thank you both for joining us. This has been a great show. I would love to continue the discussion on another podcast, because there's a wealth of information there for sure.
It's really fun. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
If you have questions or feedback, reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts, other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's book corner, and Abby's video game. We have to come up with a better
slash
name
board
for
game.
that.
Game of the week.
There you go. Game of the week. Thank you. You can sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose the Become a Patron button in the sidebar.
And Abby, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yes, I'm on Drupal Slack as ABOWMAN.
And Laura, how about you?
I am also on Drupal Slack. It's L Larrimore, so LLARRIMORE.
And John, how about you?
I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And if you're interested in EPAM, you can go to EPAM.com.
And listeners can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Toodaloo.